This is the second video in a series exploring the import of garments from Marvelous Designer and Clo3D into Carbon For Houdini. In this video we are going to import welded mesh garments and explain how to deal with some of the simulation challenges that can arise. Here we have 3 garments and a bag in Marvelous Designer, and bringing these into Carbon as welded mesh garments should be pretty simple and fast. First, let's just say something about textures. There are many options to lay out and export UVs from Marvelous, and you need to figure out which one gives you the best UV layout for your rendering pipeline. Carbon just passes through the UVs on meshes as you provide them. So here we're going to reset the UV layout to match the pattern. So in the UV editor window, we right click and reset UV to 2D arrangement. Next, we are going to take a closer look at the garments. The speed with which you can bring Marvelous garments into Carbon is very much dependent on the quality of the garments and the layering. This outfit looks pretty good from the front, but who knows what issues might lie in wait. So let's have a look in particular at the visible buttons and make sure they are not penetrating the garment. The minimum we want from Marvelous meshes is a mesh without unexpected holes. Okay, so here you can see on the sleeve the buttons are all corrupted. It looks to me like the buttons were actually too big, so they collided, and Marvelous can't handle that. And it's the same here on the other sleeve. The rest of the garment looks pretty much okay though. So one approach here is just to delete all the buttons and re-add them in Carbon. But I'm going to leave some that are not intersecting so we can demonstrate various options for handling them. So let's delete the sleeve buttons and then rerun the sim to fix the holes. If you're trying to match the original look, it's important to not run the sim too long, or it may change the drape significantly. Just check when you import the meshes into Houdini that the mesh is clean on the sleeves. If it is not, then you will have to sim a bit longer and re-export. Now let's just double check everything else. That looks pretty much okay. There could be something going on with the trousers around the waist, but we can double check that once we're in Houdini. Okay, so now we are going to export each of the garments as a separate welded mesh. But before we do that, let's just check the mesh resolution. If we select all the panels in the 2D pattern window and look at the particle distance in the property editor, then if it's red, that means the panels have different particle distances. If it's white, then they are all the same. Here it's white and set to 5. Now 5 is pretty high res, especially as many of these panels are flat. So if we were to select the front panel of the jumper and scroll down, we'd see it had 60,000 triangles with a particle distance of 5, which is complete overkill. We really want to match the panel mesh resolution to the sizes of the creases we expect. There is no sense in having high-res meshes for predominantly flat areas. That's just making a simulation run slower unnecessarily. Now with many simulation solutions, the challenge is they can't correctly manage the mass of a welded garment with varying mesh resolution, as they're assigning the same mass to each vertex. So high resolution areas are actually heavier. However, Carbon is more advanced and handles the mass of a varying mesh resolution correctly. Typically, we would aim for a particle distance of 10, where we don't have the need for tight creases. So in this garment, I think only the sleeves and the back of the trousers need a particle distance of 5. The rest can be 10. 10 would make the front of the jumper around 15,000 triangles, which is much more appropriate. Now, with all the pattern pieces selected, we hold Shift and click on the sleeves and the back of the leg pieces, removing them from the selection. Now change the particle distance to 10. We are now ready to start exporting the garments. So let's begin with the jacket. In the pattern window, select all the panels of the jacket and go to File, Export, OBJ Selected. We're going to call this Jacket Sim. And we want a single object, welded, thin. We do not want unified UV, and we prefer to work in centimeters. And we want to save this to a zip file. Click OK, and then repeat that process for the other garments and the bag. Now, to save the avatar, we need to do File, Export OBJ, but this time not the selected version. And now you get to pick which elements you want to export. So uncheck the patterns and graphics, just leaving the avatar. The rest of the settings are the same as for the garments. For now, I will keep Marvelous open, as you may need to pop back to re-export something if we find any issues in Houdini. So let's go ahead and unpack the zip files, and then we're ready to move into Houdini. Here we have a default carbon graph in the Houdini SOP for setting up welded garments, and I have already named the nodes to match the garments we are importing. This default carbon graph is available as a download in the Carbon forum. So let's dive in and take a closer look. First, we have to import the meshes with the Labs OBJ importer node. This node handles the materials correctly. To access this node, you need to have installed SideFX Labs, which is one of the options when you're installing Houdini. Now we select the jacket OBJ for import, and then use the other import nodes for the other garments and the avatar. The next thing we need to do is run the meshes through a polydoctor node to clean them up, as you get issues with things like zero-size triangles and similar with the meshes coming out of Marvelous. We also by default want to identify any intersecting triangles so that we can remove them from collision. Here, using these color and delete nodes, we can see if there are any intersecting triangles. Checking out the jacket, we can see the buttons are corrupted, but that's okay as we're going to remove them from the sim anyway. If we look next at the trousers, we can see in red the mesh intersections. We can see a lot of red around the buttons, and we need to check that the buttons are not intersecting the garment mesh. I've had a close look, and only this button on the back is actually an issue. To play safe, I'm going back into Marvelous, deleting that button, and a quick resim to seal the mesh hole, and we export and back in Houdini in 5 minutes. And here we see now it's gone. Okay, so we want to take all those other intersecting triangles in red and remove them from Carbon's cloth collision. We can do that by passing the valid polygroup coming out of the polydoctor into the associated carbon cloth node as a primitive group that will be used for collision, as you can see here for the trousers. This is such a common issue that we have set up every one of the cloth nodes with that set up as default. In this hidden box, we also have nodes to expand the group of triangles being removed from collision if that turns out to be required, but right now they are bypassed. Okay, let's move on to the jumper. That's looking pretty clean. So moving on to the bag, here we can see some intersection around the zipper parts. Those will get removed from collision, but also this bag has no real reason to have self-collision enabled. So let's disable that to make it even more robust for simulation. We can disable self-collision either in the cloth node or the associated material node. Here we can see that the bag cloth node is linked to a material node, so we need to make that change in the material node, which is over here. And we just untick self-collision. As the material node is linked to the cloth node, it will automatically update the cloth node when we reset the simulation. Okay, so finally moving on to the avatar. We have here the mesh feeding into a carbon collider node, and we will come back and set that node up in a moment. So just to recap, each garment has a material node and a cloth node, and in that cloth node the associated material node is identified and linked with the Use Material checkbox. In addition, the cloth node defines the group of primitives that take part in collision, with the empty default meaning that everything collides. So now let's start looking at each mesh in turn and set up their simulation properties. Best to start with the trousers, as they will fall down if we don't have them bound to the body. First thing we need to do is to separate the main mesh of the trousers from the buttons, etc. that are not attached. So we go into selection mode and double click a face on the mesh of the trousers to select all the connected triangles. You'll see here that the buttons are not connected to the trousers mesh. This is a problem, as they will just fall off when we simulate, and after a few seconds they will be 6 million units away, and that will cause problems. So we need to remove them from the trousers mesh for now. To do that, we create a group that contains the selected primitives, and then a delete node set to delete non-selected. Okay, so now you can see we've removed the primitives that are not attached. Next, we want to select all the points around the top of the trousers and create a group. Then we add a carbon binding node, and I like to insert that before the merge node so that I know which cloth it relates to. But that means I have to select the full path name for the objects that are to be bound. So we select the collider and the trousers, and for the child point group, which is the trousers, we select the belt group we created. We can leave the parent collider primitive group empty because we don't really care exactly where the trousers bind. Now I already have a carbon simulation node in the graph, And if we go down to that, then I can enable physics draw. So when we reset the simulation, we will see what Carbon is seeing. But first, let's just tear off a parameter panel, as we're going to be doing this reset a few times. Now, on simulation reset, you can see the bindings in green and yellow. Also, with physics draw turned on for the trousers, we can see the triangles in the mesh that have been removed from collision. They are still actually there in the cloth mesh, contributing to its behavior, and we can bind or stitch them, for example, but they are just not part of the collision mesh. Okay, so let's see how the trousers simulate. First, we need to set up the scene simulation parameters. As we noted earlier, we have fairly high-res garments, and to support that, we will need a reasonable number of iterations per subdivision, say 100. And to handle the multi-layer clothing collision, we also need a reasonable number of subdivisions per frame, say 50. So in total, that's 5,000 iterations per frame. We have our garments in centimeters, so we need to set the scene length scale to 0.01. If you're doing a lot of repetitive similar garment setups, then you'll really want to standardize on simulation settings that work for most or all of your garments, and also an associated set of material nodes to work under those simulation settings. Okay, let's just run one frame to see if we have any big issues with the trousers. And another one. Looks pretty good. If we had a trouser material node we wanted to use, we could just drop that in here now. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to stiffen up the trousers a bit. And a density of 0.25, which is 250 grams per square meter, is not unreasonable for trousers. Thickness is 1 millimeter, i.e. 0.1 centimeters, which is reasonable. Let's have a bend stiffness of 5, and that should all work for a basic test. So let's reset the simulation and run a few more frames. All looking pretty good. Let's turn off physics draw on the simulation node and have a look at the textured trousers. The button flap is open as it's not yet bound with a button, but otherwise everything looks good. Let's bring in the jumper next, disconnecting the trousers from the sim node and connecting the jumper. No obvious intersection issues here on the start frame, so the main thing we need to look at here is the collision distance between the avatar and the jumper. Carbon uses the concept of fatness to define position of the collision surface relative to the mesh. Cloths can only have the same fatness on each side, together representing the thickness of the cloth, but colliders such as the avatar can have an inner and outer fatness that are different. Now, to get the same garment look, we need to match the intergarment distance that was used in Marvelous. Unfortunately, designers in Marvelous often have to use huge intergarment spaces to work around Marvelous's poor collision handling. So here, for example, you can see a significant gap between the avatar and the jumper mesh. Some of that is the jumper thickness, but this gap's 5 millimeters or more, and the jumper might be a couple of millimeters, a millimeter on each side of the mesh. So that's 1 millimeter of 5 millimeters being the jumper. We can visualize all this using the physics draw, increasing the jumper thickness to 5 millimeters, for example. If we don't maintain the same spacing as in Marvelous, then we won't get a comparable drape. You can use the actual spacing distance in Marvelous as a guide, but then you may still have to tweak the collision distance in Carbon, as Marvelous simulation is not 100% tracking that spacing. If it did, you wouldn't need that extra spacing. To tweak the collision distance in Carbon, we are going to expand the body outer fatness until it pokes through the garment, and then back it off by the thickness of the jumper, so it sits just under the jumper. With Carbon Physics Draw active, so we can see the collision fatness, let's start by increasing the outer fatness of the avatar to 5 millimeters. So as we're in centimeters, that's 0.5. Resetting the simulation, we can see that the fatness is not yet pushing through the jumper. So let's try 7 millimeters. Okay, that's pushing through now. Let's back off a bit to 6 millimeters. There, that looks pretty good. Okay, let's run a simulation frame with the default material properties on the jumper. Always good to run just one frame first, in case you've missed something. That's okay, let's run a few more frames. The jumper's stretching quite a bit, so let's go into our jumper material properties and increase the stiffness. Now that's looking better. Okay, let's add the trousers back to the simulation, and we need to check whether we're getting any intersection between the trousers and the jumper. You remember the trousers were standing well off the body, so I think that's unlikely. And we can double check further by using an intersection node connected to the trousers and the jumper. Can't see any issues here, so that's all good. Going back to the simulation node, we can see an issue with the expanded avatar and the trousers. It seems the trousers have a different avatar spacing to the jumper. That's easy enough to handle. We just create ourselves another carbon collider using the avatar as the mesh input, and then give this collider a different outer fatness. And then we just need to filter the trousers against the original carbon collider so they don't collide. So we add a carbon filter node, select the trousers and carbon collider 1. So now we'll bypass the original carbon collider 1 and we can set up the new avatar collider against the trousers. Let's try 3mm for outer fatness. That looks okay. Let's try 4mm. You can just see it poking through here and there. So let's back off to 3.5 and that should be good. Let's run a few frames of simulation. That's looking all okay. So moving on to the jacket. First let's check the jacket and jumper intersections with an intersection node. No obvious issues there. Next let's have a look at the polydoctor output. That looks pretty good apart from some intersections on the buttons. We're not going to sim the buttons anyway at this stage, so like the trousers, we'll just remove them. So we select all the connected primitives, and also you can see here the panels we left at a particle distance of 5 and those that we left at 10. So we create a group of the selected primitives, then add a delete node, set the delete node to non-selected and the group to group 2. Job done. Okay, so now we have the jacket. Let's enable the large avatar and enable the physics drawer to look at it against the jacket. Looks like the large avatar is too big. So let's create another filter between the jacket and collider 1. Now let's have a quick look, see if there's any obvious intersection between the trousers and the jacket. Nothing obvious, but we can revisit this with an intersection node if we run into any simulation issues. Let's run the simulation. Looks okay. Jacket is stretching a bit. So let's go stiffen it up in the material node and run some more frames. Let's do a double check on that last frame 8 and make sure nothing untoward is visible. The color up here is pretty thick, but that's how it was in Marvelous. There are plenty of tools in Carbon if you want to flatten out that collar, but in general the jacket looks good. Okay, on to the last item, the bag. Same process as before, check the polydoctor for primitive intersections. Here there are clearly some, and they will get filtered out from the collision. But also, as the bag is not going to self-collide, why don't we just remove self-collision here in its material node by unticking the self-collide box. Next, using an intersection node, we need to check if the bag intersects with the jacket. That looks okay at the sim mesh level, but visually it's pretty close. So we may need to revisit this when we have set up the collision fatness and render meshes. Okay, so let's add the bag to the sim. It's got a long strap, which is a long simulation network, so we'll probably need to increase the default stiffness to say 500. Now let's run a few frames. Oh well, something clearly wrong. The jumper is disappearing. This type of issue is often associated with bits of mesh being unconnected. Here, if we look closely at the bag, we can see parts of the zipper falling off. Falling under gravity, they are soon millions of units away. This ultimately causes an issue, and in this case it's showing up in the jumper. So, like with the buttons earlier, we can fix that by selecting the welded mesh of the bag and creating a group and a delete node just like before. After that, when we run the sim, all is good. Now you can see here in the final sim, the garments are falling closer to the body than in Marvelous. On the shoulder here, you can see the start mesh in wireframe. At this point, you can go on to adjust the garment thickness to get the look you want and also to align with render mesh thicknesses if you plan to use those. To access the simulated meshes, we use a Carbon simulation geometry node. We have a couple of those down here. Each node exposes 4 meshes, or 3 plus bypass, to another simulation geometry node. What we have handled so far are the main simulation meshes, but we still have those buttons and zipper parts, and Marvelous can also output render meshes. So what are some of the choices for handling these in our Carbon scene? Well, let's start with the simple case where we want to add back the zipper parts. We can use the Carbon deformer to do that. Why the carbon deformer rather than the Houdini deformer? The carbon deformer is up to 10 times faster, while at the same time it's more sophisticated and higher quality. Furthermore, it's consistent across all carbon platforms. Okay, so to use the carbon deformer for the zipper parts, we need a node with the zipper parts in it. So a delete node here, but this time with delete selected. And the original delete node is going to be our bag reference. Now the deformer will map the zipper parts to the bag reference, and as the bag moves, the zipper parts will track it. Okay, down here I have created a small object merge network for the bag deformer. So the first input is the driver for the deformer, and that is the output from the simulation, which is bag 1 here. The second input is the geometry we want to map, i.e. the zipper parts. So we set that to the bag zipper selection we created. The final input to the deformer is the bag reference, which is the other delete node. So the same process again to select that one. Okay, so now reset the simulation and then look at the output of the final merge node. Oh, you can see the zipper parts are not in the right place on the start frame. That's because we've forgotten an important step. We need to update the mapping on the carbon deformer. Once we've done that, you can see they are now correctly placed. You'll note that we didn't need to reset the simulation, as the deformers are outside the simulation loop. So you can change the skinning type, even the render meshes, without having to resimulate. Okay, so now, as you can see, when we simulate, the deformer maps the zipper parts to the bag as it moves. We could use this same approach on the jacket as well for the buttons. So far, we have just brought in thin simulation meshes from Marvelous, and we have set the thickness for collision during simulation, where the thin garment simulation meshes just sit in the middle of that collision thickness. But Marvelous and Clo also allows us to export thick render meshes. So here we are back in Marvelous, and we are going to export the jacket, this time as a thick render mesh. Render meshes need to be in exactly the same position as the simulation meshes. So if you've done any simulation between exporting one and the other, then the deformer will not be able to do its job. So like last time, with the jacket panel selected, we go to File, Export, OBJ Selected, and settings are all the same except we select thick rather than thin. Now having exported that, we go back into our Houdini scene. We are now going to use the jacket simulation mesh as a driver to deform that render mesh. So we need to set up the deformer node and add another Labs OBJ importer for the jacket render mesh. The importer is the second input to the deformer, the geometry. The first input, you will remember, is the driver for the deformer, and that's the simulation output for the jacket. And the last input to the deformer is the start mesh for the jacket simulation. So the deformer will map our imported jacket render mesh, including the buttons this time. This is just one simple way to handle buttons. Another way will be to remove them from the render mesh and add them as rigid buttons to the simulation, so they actually get simulated. Okay, this time, as we are replacing the simulation mesh with a render mesh, we need to remove the jacket sim mesh from the final merge node and add the output of the jacket deformer. If we go down to the simulation node, we can see the simulation mesh thickness of the jacket on the sleeve. And then if we go down to the final merge node, we can see the render mesh is thicker. When you create a deformer, it does a deformer mapping, and that can take a few seconds or longer for big meshes. So you also have the option to save these mappings and reload them with the scene. Let's run a few frames of simulation and look at the final merge node. Okay, after one frame, we can see a UV mapping issue, and the reason for that is because the UV for Marvelous render panels are on points, and we need them on vertices in Houdini. So we can use an attribute promote node to handle this. Now let's run a few frames. We can see with this thick garment that the bag strap is sinking in here and there. We can fix that in a number of ways. Maybe the easiest is just to increase the thickness of the jacket in the simulation. Let's do that, reset the simulation, and that looks good from the front, but what about the back? Okay, it's still going through the render mesh, even on the start frame. Let's just quickly double check the physics drawer of the jacket to make sure we didn't miss anything. No, the sim meshes look good with the jacket fatness at 5mm, so this is just a visual issue. We could bring in the render mesh for the bag and then tweak to get the look we want, or here we can just increase the simulation thickness of the strap to say 2mm, and that will probably fix the visual issue. So let's just do that for now. Okay, that's all sorted visually. Just to note that the carbon meshes coming out of the carbon simulation are just like any other meshes, and you can, for example, export them just by attaching a ROP Olympic output node to any of the output mesh nodes. Right, I think that's covered all the basics. In upcoming videos we will look at more advanced material handling, where we are extracting the panels from the welded mesh using a carbon UV to points node, and then using those panels to manage warp, weft and bias material properties on a per panel basis. We will also be looking at importing garments from Marvelous and Clo3D into the carbon garment processor, where panels can be automatically stitched together rather than welded. So meanwhile, thank you for watching, and we hope this was useful.